The afternoon sun beat down on Oakwood Heights, one of those pristine suburban neighborhoods where every lawn was perfectly manicured and every house looked like it belonged in a magazine. 17-year-old Marcus Johnson adjusted his backpack straps as he walked down Maple Street, coming home from his summer job at the community center. He'd been teaching kids how to code, something he was passionate about and good at. Marcus had lived in Oakwood Heights his entire life. His father, Agent David Johnson, had moved the family here when Marcus was just 5 years old, wanting to provide his son with the best schools and safest environment possible. The neighborhood had been welcoming enough over the years, though Marcus had always been acutely aware that his family was one of only 3 black families in the entire development. As he turned the corner onto his street, Marcus noticed a white sedan parked at the curb with 2 men inside watching him. The car had Oakwood Heights security emblazoned on the side in bold letters, though something about it looked off. The decals seemed hastily applied, and the car itself looked more like a personal vehicle than official security. Marcus shrugged and kept walking. He'd seen various security patrols in the neighborhood before, though they'd never paid him much attention. Today felt different. The sedan's engine started, and it began to slowly follow him down the sidewalk. Marcus's pace quickened slightly, but he told himself he was being paranoid. Still, his father had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now they were telling him something wasn't right. "Hey! Hey you!" A voice called out from behind him. Marcus turned to see 2 men getting out of the sedan. They wore ill-fitting uniforms that looked like they'd been ordered online, complete with fake badges and utility belts. The taller of the 2, a heavy-set man with a receding hairline, approached with an exaggerated swagger. "I'm Officer Patterson with Oakwood Heights Security," the man said, puffing out his chest. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area. I'm going to need to see some ID." Marcus felt his heart rate increase, but he kept his voice steady. "Suspicious activity? I'm just walking home from work, sir." "That's what they all say," the second man chimed in. He was shorter but stockier, with beady eyes that seemed to look right through Marcus. "You got any proof you belong in this neighborhood, kid?" "I live here," Marcus replied, gesturing toward his house just 3 blocks away. "I've lived here for 12 years. "Sure you do," Patterson scoffed. "Look, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Just show us some ID, and we can verify your story." Marcus knew his rights. His father had drilled them into him since he was old enough to understand. "Am I being detained?" he asked calmly. The 2 fake officers exchanged glances. "Don't get smart with us, boy," the shorter one snarled. "We're trying to keep this neighborhood safe from troublemakers like you." The racial undertone was unmistakable now. Marcus felt anger bubbling up inside him, but his father's training kicked in. "Stay calm. Document everything. Don't give them an excuse." "I haven't done anything wrong," Marcus said, pulling out his phone. "I'm going to call my father." "Put that phone away," Patterson barked, stepping closer. "We're conducting an investigation here." "Investigation into what, exactly?" Marcus asked, but he kept the phone in his hand. "Burglary reports in the area. Young man matching your description was seen casing houses," the shorter man said, clearly making it up as he went along. Marcus almost laughed at the absurdity. "Casing houses? I've been at work all day. I can show you my time sheets." "We'll be the judge of that," Patterson said, reaching for his fake radio. "This is Patterson. We've got a suspicious individual who's refusing to cooperate with our investigation." The radio crackled with static, but no one responded. Because, of course, they weren't real security officers. Marcus had had enough. He speed-dialed his father's number, which he'd memorized by heart. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Marcus? Everything okay?" "Dad, I'm about 3 blocks from home, and there are 2 guys claiming to be HOA security who are harassing me. They're demanding ID and saying I don't belong in the neighborhood." Agent David Johnson's voice immediately sharpened. "Are you safe? Can you get away?" "I'm okay for now, but they're getting aggressive. They're in a white sedan with Oakwood Heights security on the side. I'll be right there. Stay on the line." Patterson had been listening to the conversation with growing irritation. "Hang up that phone right now, or I'm going to have to place you under citizen's arrest." "Citizen's arrest for what?" Marcus asked, keeping the phone pressed to his ear. "Trespassing. Disturbing the peace. Resisting security," Patterson rattled off, clearly making up charges. In the background, Marcus could hear his father's car engine starting. "Dad, they're threatening to arrest me now." 2 minutes. "I'm 2 minutes away," came the reassuring voice through the phone. The shorter fake officer stepped forward, reaching for Marcus's arm. "That's it, kid. You're coming with us." "Don't touch me," Marcus said firmly, stepping back. "I know my rights. You're not real police officers." We don't have to be real cops to make a citizen's arrest, Patterson said with a nasty grin. Especially when punks like you are clearly up to no good. Just then, a black SUV came speeding around the corner and screeched to a halt next to the white sedan. Agent David Johnson stepped out, and even in casual clothes, his presence commanded immediate attention. At 45, he maintained the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. His FBI credentials were already in his hand as he approached. "Gentlemen," he said in a voice that could cut steel, "I'm Special Agent David Johnson with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. What seems to be the problem here?" The two fake officers went pale. Patterson's swagger evaporated instantly. We had reports of suspicious activity." Suspicious activity? Agent Johnson's eyes narrowed as he looked at his son, clearly unharmed but visibly shaken. "What kind of suspicious activity would that be?" "Well, you see, there have been break-ins in the area, and this young man matched the description." "What description would that be, exactly?" Agent Johnson stepped closer, his federal credentials still prominently displayed. "Are you telling me that my 17-year-old son, who was walking home from his job at the community center where he teaches underprivileged children computer programming, somehow matches the description of a burglar?" The shorter man tried to stammer a response. "We didn't know he was your son, sir. We were just doing our job, your job." Agent Johnson examined their fake uniforms and badges with a trained eye. "What agency did you say you work for again?" "Oakwood Heights Security," Patterson said, his voice barely above a whisper. Agent Johnson walked over to their sedan and examined the hastily applied decals. "Interesting. Because I happen to know that Oakwood Heights doesn't contract with any private security firm. In fact, I'm on the HOA board, and this is the first I'm hearing about any Oakwood Heights security." The two men exchanged panicked glances. They were trapped, and they knew it. "Let me see your security licenses," Agent Johnson continued, pulling out his phone. "And your certifications. And while we're at it, let's run those badge numbers through the system. Look, there might have been some misunderstanding." Patterson started to back toward their car. "Oh, there's definitely been a misunderstanding," Agent Johnson said coldly. "You seem to have misunderstood what happens when you impersonate security officers, harass minors, and engage in what appears to be racially motivated intimidation in a federal agent's neighborhood." Marcus watched in fascination as his father's professional persona took complete control of the situation. This wasn't just an angry parent, this was a federal law enforcement officer who had dealt with far more dangerous people than these two wannabe vigilantes. "Dad," Marcus said quietly, "they said they were going to arrest me for trespassing. In my own neighborhood." Agent Johnson's jaw tightened. "Is that so?" He looked back at the fake officers. "On what authority were you planning to make this arrest? And I want to see documentation of your legal right to detain citizens." The men had no answer. They were clearly in over their heads. "Here's what's going to happen," Agent Johnson continued, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. "You're going to provide me with your full names, addresses, and identification. Then you're going to explain to me exactly who hired you, who provided these fake uniforms and badges, and what made you think you had any legal authority to detain my son." "We were just trying to keep the neighborhood safe," the shorter man pleaded. "Safe from what? A teenager with a backpack walking home from work?" Agent Johnson's voice rose slightly. "Safe from a kid who's lived in this neighborhood longer than some of the adults. Safe from my son, who has never so much as jaywalked in his entire life." By now, the confrontation had attracted attention from other neighbors. Mrs. Chen from across the street had come out to water her plants but was obviously listening. Mr. Rodriguez from 2 doors down was pretending to check his mailbox. Marcus noticed that several people were recording the interaction with their phones. "The truth is," Agent Johnson said, his voice carrying to the growing audience, "this wasn't about safety at all. This was about 2 men who decided that a black teenager didn't belong in their vision of what this neighborhood should look like." Patterson made one last desperate attempt. "Now wait just a minute. This isn't about race. We would have stopped anyone acting suspicious." "Acting suspicious how?" Marcus spoke up, finding his voice again. "By walking? By carrying a backpack? By being black in a predominantly white neighborhood?" Agent Johnson nodded approvingly at his son. "Marcus raises an excellent point. In your professional security opinion, what specifically about his behavior warranted detention?" The men had no answer because there wasn't one. They had profiled a teenager based solely on his race and had assumed they could intimidate him into compliance. "You know what I think happened here?" Agent Johnson continued. "I think you two saw an opportunity to play out some fantasy about being neighborhood vigilantes. You got some fake uniforms, made some fake badges, and decided to patrol around looking for trouble. And when you saw my son, a black teenager in a predominantly white neighborhood, you thought you'd found an easy target. Mrs. Chen had moved closer, no longer pretending to water her plants. Agent Johnson, she called out, is everything all right? Do you need me to call the real police? That might not be a bad idea, Mrs. Chen, Agent Johnson replied without taking his eyes off the fake officers. We may need to file a report about impersonation of security personnel and harassment. The two men looked ready to bolt, but Agent Johnson stepped slightly to the side, casually blocking their path to their vehicle. Before anyone goes anywhere, he said, I want to understand the scope of this operation. How long have you been patrolling this neighborhood? How many other residents have you stopped? And most importantly, who's behind this? Marcus watched his father work with a mixture of pride and awe. This was Agent David Johnson in his element, methodical, intimidating, and absolutely relentless in pursuit of the truth. Look, this was just a misunderstanding, Patterson said desperately. We'll just leave and never come back. Oh, you'll definitely never come back, Agent Johnson agreed. But leaving isn't quite that simple now. You see, impersonating security personnel is a crime. Harassment is a crime. And depending on how we want to classify your treatment of my son, we might be looking at federal civil rights violations. The shorter man's legs seemed to give out, and he leaned heavily against their fake patrol car. Please, he said, we didn't mean any harm. We just thought, you thought what? That you could intimidate a teenager with no consequences? That nobody would stand up to your fake authority? That you could engage in racial profiling in broad daylight and get away with it? By now, a small crowd had gathered. Marcus noticed that several of his neighbors looked genuinely shocked and angry about what they were witnessing. Mrs. Patterson, no relation to the fake officer, approached with her own phone out. Agent Johnson, I recorded the whole thing, she said. These men were completely out of line. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. That might be very helpful. Marcus looked around at his neighbors, people he'd grown up around, people who had watched him grow from a little kid into a teenager. Their support felt genuine, and for the first time since this ordeal began, he felt truly safe. Dad, he said quietly, what happens now? Agent Johnson looked at his son with a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride for how Marcus had handled himself under pressure, and sadness that his son had to experience this kind of harassment at all. Now, he said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, we make sure this never happens again. To you, to any other kid in this neighborhood, or anywhere else these two might decide to play security guard. He turned back to the fake officers, who were now looking around desperately for an escape route. Here's your choice, Agent Johnson said with finality. You can cooperate fully with my investigation, provide all the information I've requested, and face whatever local charges might apply. Or you can continue this charade, and I'll make sure this becomes a federal case with federal prosecutors and federal penalties. The men looked at each other, and Marcus could see the fight go out of them completely. What do you want to know? Patterson asked. Quietly. Everything, Agent Johnson replied. Starting with who put you up to this. Over the next 20 minutes, the truth came out. The two men, Gary Patterson and Bob Miller, were unemployed friends who had gotten the idea from watching too many neighborhood watch reality shows. They'd ordered the uniforms and badges online, made the car decals themselves, and had been patrolling for about 2 weeks. They admitted they'd stopped 3 other people, all of them minorities who they deemed suspicious in the predominantly white neighborhood. You understand, Agent Johnson said as he finished taking notes, that what you've described is a pattern of racially motivated harassment, right? Both men nodded miserably. And you understand that even without official authority, your actions could be prosecuted under both state and federal law? More nodding, Agent Johnson looked around at the neighbors who had gathered. I want everyone here to understand something important. What happened to my son today is not acceptable. It's not normal. And it's not something we can allow to continue in our community. He turned back to Patterson and Miller. You're going to remove those fake decals from your car immediately. You're going to dispose of those fake uniforms and badges. You're going to provide me with a full written statement about your activities. And you're never going to set foot in this neighborhood again. And if we see you anywhere near any of our kids, Mrs. Chen added firmly, we'll call the real police immediately. There was a murmur of agreement from the other neighbors. Marcus watched as the two men, thoroughly defeated, began peeling the fake security decals off their car. It was almost pathetic to see how quickly their authority fantasy crumbled when faced with actual consequences. Marcus, his father said, putting a hand on his shoulder, how are you doing? I'm okay, Dad. Thanks for coming so quickly. You handled that perfectly, Agent Johnson said with genuine pride. You stayed calm, you knew your rights, and you called for help when you needed it. I'm proud of you. As the fake officers finished removing their decals and climbed into their now unmarked sedan, Agent Johnson called out one final warning. "Gentlemen, I'll be filing a report with local police about today's incident. I'll also be checking with other neighborhoods to see if you've been operating elsewhere. If I find out you've resumed this behavior anywhere, at any time, I will personally ensure that you face the full consequences of your actions." The car pulled away quickly, leaving behind a crowd of neighbors who were still processing what they'd witnessed. Mrs. Rodriguez approached Marcus directly. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that, Mijo. You've been nothing but respectful and kind since you were a little boy. Those men were way out of line." Similar sentiments came from other neighbors, and Marcus found himself feeling genuinely supported by his community in a way he hadn't expected. "Dad," he said as the crowd began to disperse, "do you think they'll actually stay away?" Agent Johnson considered the question seriously. "I think they're scared enough right now to avoid any more trouble. But more importantly, I think our neighbors got a good look at what racial profiling actually looks like, and they won't stand for it." As they walked the final 3 blocks home, Marcus reflected on what had just happened. It had been frightening and humiliating, but it had also shown him something important about standing up to intimidation. "Dad, what would have happened if you hadn't shown up?" "You would have been fine," Agent Johnson said confidently. "You were handling it exactly right. You stayed calm, you documented what was happening, and you called for help. That's exactly what you should do in a situation like that. But what if they had actually tried to arrest me? Then they would have found themselves facing very serious federal charges for kidnapping," his father replied grimly. "But honestly, Marcus, I don't think they had the courage to follow through on their threats. Bullies like that usually back down when they meet real resistance." They reached their house, a modest 2-story colonial with a well-maintained lawn and a basketball hoop in the driveway. It looked exactly like every other house in the neighborhood, which was exactly the point. This was home. This was where Marcus belonged. "Are you going to follow through on those reports?" Marcus asked as they walked up the driveway. "Absolutely. What they did was illegal, and there need to be consequences. Plus, I want to make sure they haven't been harassing other families in other neighborhoods." That evening, as Agent Johnson filed his reports and Marcus tried to process the day's events, both father and son reflected on the larger implications of what had happened. For Marcus, it was a stark reminder that despite growing up in a safe, affluent neighborhood, he wasn't immune to the kind of racial profiling that affected Black Americans everywhere. But it was also a reminder that he had allies, his father, his neighbors, and a community that was willing to stand up for what was right. For Agent Johnson, it was a painful reminder that his son would face challenges that he couldn't always shield him from. But it was also proof that the lessons he'd tried to instill, stay calm, know your rights, document everything, call for help, actually worked when it mattered most. 3 weeks later, Marcus learned that Patterson and Miller had been charged with impersonating security officers and harassment. They'd also been banned from several other neighborhoods where they'd been operating similar schemes. More importantly, the incident had sparked conversations throughout Oakwood Heights about racial profiling and community safety. The HOA organized a community meeting where residents discussed how to ensure that all families felt welcome and safe in their neighborhood. Marcus even ended up speaking at the meeting, sharing his experience and talking about what it felt like to be questioned about belonging in the place he'd called home for most of his life. "I love this neighborhood," he told the packed community center. "I've grown up here, I've made friends here, and I want to keep living here. But I also want to make sure that other families who might not look like the majority of our neighbors, feel just as welcome and safe as I do." The response was overwhelmingly positive. Several neighbors approached the Johnson family afterward to apologize for not doing more to welcome minority families over the years and to pledge their support going forward. Mrs. Chin summed it up best: "This is our neighborhood, and that means it's all of our responsibility to make sure everyone feels like they belong here." As Marcus started his senior year of high school that fall, he reflected on how much he'd learned from that afternoon encounter with fake security officers. He'd learned about courage, about community, and about the importance of standing up for what's right, but most importantly, he'd learned that home isn't just a place, it's a community of people who have your back when things get tough. And despite everything that had happened, Oakwood Heights still felt like home. The fake HOA cops had tried to make him feel like an outsider in his own neighborhood. Instead, they'd helped him realize just how much he belonged there, and how many people were willing to fight to make sure he knew it. Agent David Johnson kept the incident report in his files, not just as a law enforcement matter, but as a reminder of the afternoon when his son showed him what real courage looked like. Marcus had faced down intimidation with dignity, had stood his ground without escalating the situation, and had demonstrated the kind of character that made his father proud every single day. The fake badges and uniforms were long gone, disposed of as evidence of a failed attempt at vigilante justice. But the real security, the security that comes from knowing you belong somewhere and that your community will stand with you, that was stronger than ever, and in Oakwood Heights, that security was real.